It ends with a knock at the boardroom door, quietly, relentlessly. A letter, an offer, a price that cannot be ignored. One family, 186 years of stewardship, and a single corporate move that changed everything. How does a company built on Quaker conviction become a prize to be taken? How does a culture become a line item? Stay with me. I'll show you the slow arithmetic, the human choices, and the moments when the ideal was quietly diluted into ordinary shares. Listen close now. When John Cadbury opened a small grocer's shop in Birmingham in 1824, he sold tea, coffee, and cocoa. The trade was simple. The purpose behind it was not. The Cadburys were Quakers. Their faith meant restraint, contemplation, and a deep sense of duty to other human beings. Over generations, that duty became policy. It became bricks and streets and hospitals. By the late 19th century, Cadbury was not simply a confectioner. It was a social experiment. Walk through Bournville and you see the results. Houses with gardens, schools, baths. Not token philanthropy, but infrastructure meant to steady a workforce and a community. Employment meant more than wages. It meant care, education, health. The company ran medical clinics. It banned alcohol from company premises for a reason tied to Quaker temperance. It pioneered paid holidays and pensions at times when such things were rare. The company's identity was not only its chocolate, it was the way it treated the people who made it. For a long time, family stewardship made that identity durable. The Cadburys, from John to his sons and grandchildren, held firm on a set of moral priorities. Decisions were made in parlors and family meetings as much as in boardrooms. There was a public face, the logo, the advertising, the chocolate that tasted like comfort. And there was a private purpose, the village, the schools, the steady hand that said, in effect, we will look after our own. But modern business is noisy. Markets amplify risk. Competition demands scale. And so, in the late 1960s, a choice was made that would begin to loosen the family's grip. Merger. Cadbury merged with Schweppes in 1969. On paper, it read like many mid-20th century corporate combinations. Complementary lines, diversification, a hedge against cyclical swings. Schweppes brought beverages, Cadbury brought sweets. Together they could move into new markets, negotiate global supply contracts, and share distribution. The merger answered a business problem: how to grow and protect market share in an increasingly national and international marketplace. What the merger also did was alter ownership and governance in ways that mattered, subtly but irreversibly. A family that once controlled decisions through concentrated shareholding now partnered with a broader corporate structure. The company's capital became more complex. More outsiders entered the shareholder list. Professional managers rose up through layered hierarchies. Incentives changed. Slower, moral choices began to compete with faster financial pressures. Start with something concrete: ownership. When a family's control diminishes, the ability to veto short-term moves or insist on long-term social investments erodes. Shares are issued, alliances are formed, boards grow. With each step, a family's votes are diluted. With each dilution, the ideal, the Quaker approach to labor and welfare, moves from being the presumed baseline to a topic for debate. That debate tends to resolve not on principle, but on numbers: quarterly profits, earnings per share, cost synergies. The language of stewardship becomes the language of efficiency. A factory is no longer primarily a community hub, it is a unit of production. A worker's afternoon class becomes a line item under human resources. That's forensic economics in practice, tracing the slow trade-off, transaction by transaction, that shifts the company's incentives. Across the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Cadbury Schweppes navigated global markets, new product lines, new geographies. The brand remained beloved, yet every strategic choice, which plant to invest in, which market to seed, how to price, had to contend with shareholders who expected returns. Professional managers, rewarded for hitting targets, learned to think in terms of margins rather than missions. This is not a moral indictment of managers. It is a structural observation. When ownership is concentrated in a family, decisions often reflect a mix of emotional legacy and economic sense. When ownership widens, the calculus shifts towards standardized metrics. The ideal survives if it can be measured and preserved within those metrics. If it can't, it is prone to atrophy. Now, fast forward. Add one more mechanism: financialization. In the 1990s and 2000s, corporate finance evolved. Private equity emerged as a predator and a partner. Executive pay structures, stock options, analyst expectations. All these instruments pressed publicly traded firms toward predictable, often short-term gains. Brands that had once been villages and clinics increasingly needed to produce clean earnings beats in order to survive in the market narrative. All of this laid groundwork. The heavy lift, the merger, was decades earlier. The scaffolding for dilution had been assembled piece by piece: dispersed share blocks, professionalized management, global investors who cared more about cash flow than community festivals. The ideal remained in the architecture of policy, but its enforcement was weaker. Which brings us to 2010. It began with an offer. Kraft Foods, an American food giant, launched a bid for Cadbury. The process was quick and brutal, by contrast to the patient institution Cadbury had been. It was described by many as hostile, an unwanted suitor pressing on the door until someone there agreed to open. Boardroom debates turned into headlines. Politicians weighed in. Consumers organized petitions. For many people, the struggle felt existential, not just about ownership of a brand, but about the survival of a way of life that had been intertwined with a region for a century. In early 2010, Kraft's final bid was accepted, a purchase valued at roughly $11.5 billion. The Cadbury family's formal control, 186 years of stewardship, was over. How did it end that way? The forensic answer is layered. First, the family's influence had been diluted for decades. Family trusts and shareholdings still existed, but they were not an absolute veto. The family did not own enough to single-handedly block a determined bidder. Over time, trusts had diversified. Shares were sold to finance expansions, to buy out other investors, to fund pensions. The family's voice was no longer the final word. Second, the corporate form by 2010 was different. Cadbury was a publicly listed symbol. That listing meant a constant stream of valuations from analysts and investors. It meant pressure to deliver returns to a diffuse group of shareholders with varying time horizons. A high offer from a suitor looked less like an affront and more like an opportunity to monetize an asset that had appreciated under the market's gaze. Third, the bidder, Kraft, had incentives structured around acquisitions. In an age where growth through M&A is often faster than organic expansion, a large cash offer can outweigh cultural resistance. Kraft's strategy was to consolidate brands and extract synergies, whether that meant cost-cutting, supply chain rationalization, or reassign production. The logic of the acquirer favored efficiency over tradition. Fourth, public outrage, however passionate, rarely translates into binding legal barriers. Campaigns, MPs' speeches, newspaper editorials, they rallied sentiment. They slowed the deal, perhaps altered a few terms, inspired politicians to speak of national brands and identity. But in the end, corporate law and shareholder rights determined the outcome. And when the takeover concluded, the consequences were immediate and emotional. Plants consolidated. Jobs were reorganized. Practices that had been part of the company's DNA were examined through a ledger. The village of Bournville remained as a neighborhood of well-built houses, but the company that made those houses part of its mission was no longer under the same control. Pause with me on a detail. A factory floor where a cocoa bean becomes a bar of chocolate. For a worker whose grandfather worked the same line, the difference between family ownership and corporate ownership is not just governance. It's predictability of care. Will the company subsidize evening classes? Will it fund a clinic? Will it think annually in terms of community projects or quarterly in terms of expense ratios? Those are not abstract queries. They are the lived difference between two regimes of corporate purpose. Let's not romanticize entirely. Cadbury under family rule also faced commercial challenges. It was not immune to missteps. But the point of this documentary is forensic, to trace how the mechanisms of finance and governance can erode cultural commitments. When ideals are not embedded in enforceable covenants, when they rely on human memory and goodwill, the market has ways of turning them into optional extras. Consider now a counterexample. Companies that survive being public while retaining identity. How do they do it? Often through explicit trusts, charitable foundations, golden shares, or controlling stakes that preserve decision rights. Sometimes through strong brand governance codified in charters or legal structures that enshrine worker or community rights. These tools are not bulletproof, but they create friction. They make takeovers harder. They make cultural erosion slower. Cadbury's story is instructive because it shows what happens when those protections are not strong enough or when they are gradually loosened. The merger with Schweppes in 1969 was not a betrayal in itself. It was a rational business move, but it started a chain. Each subsequent choice, selling shares, hiring non-family CEOs, pursuing aggressive expansion, added friction that favored capital over culture. By 2010, the balance had tipped. Now, a quiet question. Could the family have done anything differently? Hindsight offers clarity that was not available in real time. The family could have kept a larger voting stake. They could have written binding covenants into corporate charters. They could have resisted diversification strategies that required capital they didn't want to raise. Each option had trade-offs. Holding control would have constrained growth. Locking mission into law would have made raising capital more difficult. Governance is rarely between a perfect and a perfect solution. It is a series of choices, each with costs. But the forensic economics approach gives us a tool beyond moralizing. It allows us to map the exact levers that changed behavior: share issuance, board composition, incentive plans, merger terms, pension liabilities, capital spending decisions. Read those levers, and you can predict, with some accuracy, where the cultural priorities will land. Where capital votes, culture becomes negotiable. And yet, the human story persists. In the weeks after 2010, communities organized. Former workers told stories in local newspapers. Customers boycotted or swore allegiance. Public figures debated whether a national brand could be sold at all. That moral energy did matter. It influenced reputational cost calculations and in some cases led to concessions from the buyer. But it did not, in the end, reverse the structural facts of ownership. Halfway through this story, a small request. If this account is resonating, there are more stories like it, exploring the intersection of money and meaning. If you want them, subscribe below. Quietly. No fanfare. Just more careful unravelings of corporate lives. Back to the arc. What follows a hostile takeover is predictable in certain ways. Integration plans, managerial shifts, alignment of processes to the acquirer's systems. But there is also a ripple effect. Consumer trust can be shaken, supplier relationships recalibrated, and local economies can feel the pressure of optimization. Sometimes the acquirer keeps the brand, uses its cachet, and the product continues. Sometimes changes in ingredient sourcing or production methods alter taste and identity. And sometimes the local philanthropic commitments that were once spontaneous are formalized as contractual obligations, or they disappear under new priorities. Look at the final third of this story and you see the emotional crescendo. This is where individuals feel the weight of institutional choices. The Cadbury name still evokes childhood memories for millions. For many, The takeover did not merely represent a balance sheet adjustment. It represented a severing of a pact between producer and community. That feeling explains the ferocity of the response in media and parliament, and it explains why economists and historians return to the case as a lesson in corporate destiny. We are left with a larger question. Can institutions preserve ideals while competing in global markets? The answer is yes, but it requires intentional architecture. It requires recognizing that ideals are a kind of capital, social capital, and that like any capital, they need protection. That protection can be legal, it can be financial, and it can be cultural. Corporations that succeed in balancing these demands are often those that embed mission into governance, not merely into annual reports. In the case of Cadbury, the dilution was not a single dramatic act. It was accumulation. The barter of values for capital rarely appears as a villainous monologue. It appears as a series of reasonable choices that compound into an outcome far from the original intent. That is the key forensic insight. When you map the sequence, you see the shape of the decline. You also see where intervention might have mattered. Remember the factory floor one more time. Imagine two paths forward for such a place. One, where ownership is dispersed and the board answers to markets. That factory is optimized, perhaps relocated, perhaps automated, perhaps the company's local investments are cut. Two, where ownership retains a mission clause. That factory is more likely to retain community programs, training, and local partnerships. The difference is not mystical. It is legal and financial. As we close, consider the Cadbury legacy not as lost, but as transformed. The chocolate bars remain on shelves. The stories of Bournville remain in brick and tradition. But the mechanism that once guaranteed those outcomes, family stewardship, is no longer the primary force. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Ideals survive when they are institutionalized. They fade when left to memory alone. If you care about the continuation of a company's cultural legacy, you must care about the forms of ownership, the levers of governance, and the incentives that animate decision-makers. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, share it quietly with someone who cares about how money shapes meaning. Subscribe for more investigations into legacy, capital, and choice. And if you find yourself passing a Bournville house or holding a chocolate bar in your hand, remember the people who thought to build schools and baths into their business model, and the fragile chain of decisions that determines whether such experiments endure.